Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be doing a follow-up to my previous video, which was a review and demo of me as a new user trying out the Bubble low-code application development platform. And what exactly do I mean by low code? Well, low code is a kind of a new industry of software applications on the cloud, which allow you to build an application like a full web application without having to know any programming. Let's take a look at the Wikipedia definition. So Wikipedia considers a low-code development platform as something that provides a development environment that you create application software through a graphical user interface instead of traditional hand-coded computer programming. So essentially what that means is it's kind of a more business user kind of friendly way of building an app, but you could configure how the components and the data will be operating from there without having to touch any code. And this could actually mean a lot of different things, I think. For example, WordPress theoretically could probably be considered a type of low-code platform in that once it's set up, you have everything that you need to administer the application and make changes to it and add content and control that content that's being published through your WordPress application. If there's other features that you want, there are plenty of plugins you can use that are already coded for you, so you don't have to touch any PHP code or know a whole lot about the whole HTTP server sort of thing. That's all taken care of for you with WordPress, and you could focus on the application and business logic. And another example of a low-code application you could probably argue would be something like Microsoft Access or even a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Those are both ways of creating structures to store your data, and they don't require any formalized programming knowledge in order to get those applications to work. In Microsoft Access, you could build very impressive mini applications, and I've seen this in a couple of instances. I've built applications myself in Microsoft Access where you could drag and drop components onto a form and do your data entry that way. When I was working with the Bubble application, it kind of reminded me a lot of that Microsoft Access, except that it was on the cloud. It provided you some built-in user management tools, and it kind of took that concept to the next level. Whereas with an Access database, you're kind of stuck on one computer, one user. Using something like Bubble, you could open up that data entry to a variety of users that operate remotely. So I think in an application like this, where you're trying to simplify the process of development and make it so that people who are not as tech savvy or not trained specifically in program are empowered to build a full application, one of the trade-offs I think gets made is that the more user-friendly that the application platform tries to be, the less flexible it becomes in what you can do. So when I was working with Bubble, I found it really difficult to insert my own scripting. For example, there's one part in my previous video where I just wanted to generate a random number, and I had trouble figuring out how to do that. If I was using a system like Ruby on Rails, it would be really easy to just use the random number generate function. But using a system like Bubble, they have this wrapper around the whole application logic at the low-level application logic, and you have to use their interface. And maybe there's a way to do it. I didn't figure out how to do that, but it's certainly kind of by hiding all of the messiness that goes into computer program design and the computer sciencey stuff. They kind of shield you while at the same time making it more difficult for you to do many of the things that you can do if you were using an application that could be customized. So I'd say that's kind of the drawback of using a low-code system, and depending on what the system is and how it's designed will determine how much flexibility that you get. So what are you getting? You're handling the server infrastructure to run it, kind of handled and automated for you. You're not working with the difficult to figure out AWS and Linux servers or Heroku or something like that. The application infrastructure itself is handled for you. So you don't have to worry so much about updating all the dependencies and packages like you do in JavaScript or like in Rails, all of the gems and upgrading from Rails 6 to Rails 7. All of that stuff is kind of handled for you. So it's a lot more business user type of friendly. And in general, it empowers somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of technical training to do a lot more. You don't need a software engineer to try out a concept or try to build an application that fulfills a really simple function. So here's a few areas where I think this might be idealized for use. One of them would probably be if you have a data entry sort of thing. I've been on teams before where we're sharing an Excel spreadsheet and you have multiple people on a team writing notes, adding rows to that spreadsheet, and then sometimes it can get pretty messy because you have people in there who put the wrong data type inside of a column, and that'll throw off any aggregations that you're trying to do, and you have issues with the data being locked if multiple people are trying to access that spreadsheet at the same time. In a business setting, you might want an easy way of organizing a data entry function like that. So one way that you could do it is by starting a little bubble application where you could have people from different workflows. If they have to all go to the same form, they could go to your bubble application form and fill it out. I think another good use for this might be prototyping an application. So if you have an idea for an application concept and then you want to test it out on some users, a system like this would allow you to get a small minimum viable product up and running so that you could demonstrate it and get some user feedback. So prototyping's a really good use for this. And then when you have a prototype, you could take it and demonstrate it to somebody who might be a potential investor, or better yet, a more technical person who can take that idea that you have in that small app that you've created there and put it in a more formalized programming language, which would allow you to scale it a lot better. You know, from that standpoint, you could easily use this just to convey your idea for a design of an application. Now, let's get into why I think you might run into some problems in using a tool like Bubble. And I think the main problem comes with scalability when you're trying to use it for a large data set, or you have a very complex application, or an application that's going to be used by a lot of users, like a very general audience. Well, I'm quite sure that this platform is very capable and you could probably get a lot done with it. At some point, I think you're probably going to hit some limitations. So when I was first testing this out, one of the things that kind of impressed me with it was that it demos very well. When going through the component tutorials, where it was just kind of getting you familiar with how the workflows work and how to drag and drop components and wire them up to your data tables, I think all that played very nicely in the demonstration and the tutorials. Where I started running into problems is where I kind of want to deviate from that and do my own thing and sort of go off the road from what is already scripted out in those tutorials. And of course, it's kind of expected that you're going to run into some problem solving whenever you're trying to attack a new problem. But as I kind of said earlier, things that for me as a web developer seem really basic, like writing a script to come up with a random number or transforming the data in a certain way, it seemed a little bit difficult to incorporate ways of changing the data or modifying it or presenting it in a different way. I think that was one of the weaknesses of the platform. And maybe there's some ways of doing it, but I don't think it was very easy to do from what I've seen, and as somebody just trying it out for the first time. I really got the sense that the way that a bubble application is designed, you have your form fields and they very directly modify the data that you're storing and retrieve it. But a lot of applications call for a transformation of the data into a different format. And what you're trying to get out of the application is an aggregation of that data into something else that's more useful to you. So some examples of this might be building reports on things, controlling who could access certain aspects of the data, who enters it, and then you put it all together in some particular format, because in a business setting you might have people in different roles with different workflows, and those all intersect to build the main data product that you're putting together. And in some cases, the data that you're trying to add to make your information and application meaningful might come from an external API. All of that is pretty much programming, and if Bubble is trying to kind of shield you from having to do the programming, that's where you have that issue of user friendliness in building the interface for it versus the flexibility that you have from getting into the code. Now, I think one of the ways that Bubble tries to get around this is with plugins. They have ways that you could connect it to external APIs, but then if you're getting to that point where you have an external API doing your processing, then it could end up where you have a Bubble application that pretty much all it's doing for you is providing a nice front-end interface that probably could supplement the function of something like a JavaScript framework like React, but then in the end you might end up doing some more traditional programming again. So another thing when I was working with Bubble that kind of frustrated me was that they kind of dumbed down the terminologies that were being used in their system to make it more non-technical person friendly. For example, what would probably be considered a database table, they were calling a thing, and that kind of fulfills like what I'm familiar, conceptually, and that conceptually kind of does what I think in Ruby on Rails you'd be calling an active record object, which correlates to a database table. And there were a few things like that where I feel like the system designers were trying to make it more user-friendly and kind of protect you from having to deal with technical terminology. But for me as a technical person, and I'm quite sure many people who would be interested in a platform like this might be tech savvy to some degree, it was a little bit confusing and frustrating that they just didn't come out and say that in trying to make it more user friendly. Now, other programming platforms, and there are many of them to try now, probably aren't like that. I just happened to pick Bubble randomly as a first one to try out. From what I've seen of the demos online of one of their competitors, Caspio, that one seems to use a lot more database terminologies, and I think some of these other platforms might be more friendly to technical people, and as a result, I would imagine you probably have a little bit more flexibility in how you're using them and what the capabilities are. Finally, I think when you're trying to build an application, whether you're using a low-code platform or a traditional programming platform, the difficult part of designing your application is always going to be how you're going to structure the data in the application itself to fulfill the business logic requirement that you're trying to meet. For example, in a lot of my other videos where I'm doing little stock journaling tools, or my recent video about building a little e-voting tool, one of the big challenges of writing those applications was figuring out the database design so that it could accommodate the type of information that I'm trying to store and the problem that I'm trying to solve. And there's no getting around that. If you need your data to be structured a certain way, it's very important that your platform enables you to structure it to meet those needs and doesn't get in your way by trying to sort of like hide the messiness of the database from you. I really felt like that was one of the limitations or drawbacks of using this particular system, in that they seem to sort of put a wrapper around the raw data, and that kind of makes it difficult to modify your data and go in there and make custom transformations to it or relations within the data structure. One of the things I thought was kind of weird was when I tried testing out the data modification feature, where I thought it was modifying the table structure, but it wasn't. That feature was actually for making adjustments to the data itself. You have to upgrade your plan for that in order to do that, but it seems very spreadsheet driven. So I think this application Bubble is designed around the assumption that your data needs are going to be somewhat simple and not have a lot of complexities to them and complex relations. And then that brings me to another thing to consider when using one of these low-code platforms, is that they have enough complexity and depth to them that you could probably very easily become an expert in using low-code platforms yourself. There's definitely a level of skill involved in doing it right and knowing which low-code platform to use for the particular business situation that you want to apply it to. So that's a level of expertise right there. And then, then you're faced with the choice, if you're looking at this as sort of like a career sort of choice, you could learn JavaScript and specialize in being a JavaScript developer and use Postgres databases. Or maybe there's a career path where you could look at low-code platforms and all of the different companies that offer them and become a specialist in the domain area of these types of systems. But I really think to do them right and to get the most out of them, that's an expertise in its own. And that's something to consider as well, is that these systems, I think what's the industry hype around them is that it can technically, like, the goal is you could probably take away some need for technical knowledge and technical experts, and therefore you don't have to pay a developer to do certain things. But I could easily see that going down some sort of like a rabbit hole where you just end up needing a technical specialist in the low-code platform itself at some point. So whether or not a low-code platform lives up to its promises and can deliver the costs is kind of dependent on your situation and exactly what your business needs are and how complex of an application it is that you're trying to build. I think a lot of the sort of industry think tank reports that build up how much low code is going to be a force in the industry over the next few years. I think a lot of that hype is similar in some respects to things that you hear about other areas of technology, such as, maybe artificial intelligence, or maybe self-driving cars or electric power cars, where it's very forward-thinking to think about those things, but in reality, you probably get a little bit of a combination of this futuristic, idealistic way of how those things play out, but they don't kind of play out fully of what everybody thinks it could be, or it's not quite as transformative to the future as you think. What you get is some thing in between where it has certain cases where it's used and it's effective, but it probably isn't going to replace everything in the way that some of the industry analysts would make you think it is. For example, I don't think you're going to be getting rid of the need for JavaScript and Ruby on Rails anytime soon, and that it's all going to be replaced with low code. I think there's going to be areas where a low code application makes sense and it's applicable, but for more complex application and certain business needs, it'll make more sense and it'll be a more economical decision to go with the traditional programming system route. And one more thing to consider is that when you go on one of these platforms and build your application there, yes, it's very nice that they handle a lot of the tech infrastructure for you, where they're running the server capacity and the hosting for it. And they're also taking care of your database and managing that. All of those DevOps sort of things could be very complex topics of their own to deal with and make setting up a website difficult. But anytime you put your application on one piece of infrastructure or another, you become more dependent on it. So when it comes to these low-code application systems, you end up having your application in that company's system and their database, and it makes you a little bit more dependent on them. So for example, it seems like one of the ways that they get you to pay more money is if the amount of data that you're using or the amount of capacity that you need grows. At some point, you may not want that, and you may want to have your own infrastructure, and it may be more cost effective for you to run your own servers. But if you've built your whole application in Bubble or a similar system, then all of the application is ingrained in there and the way they do things. And to extract it is kind of a complex ordeal, because you have to figure out how to extract the data and convert that data into something that's database friendly, or at least compatible with whatever new platform's data format that you're transferring it to. And you might also have to rewrite all of the business logic. So my final thought is that the desire for low-code systems in the industry is driven by just wanting to be practical and cut costs, and not having to pay a very highly skilled, very trained engineer to develop a small application when there may be an easier solution. And that might be the ideal case for these sort of things, because you could have like a regular business person without all of that technical training be able to figure out how to do a lot. It's about increasing productivity. And when it comes to increasing productivity, that's one of the reasons that I think Rails 7 and the Hotwire framework is very interesting, because it kind of takes away a lot of that, or at least they're trying to make it so that a Rails developer doesn't have to do as much JavaScript. And if you're building an application, you won't have to maintain the whole infrastructure of a front end. In addition to your Rails application, you'll have this small, lightweight JavaScript framework that makes your website a little more dynamic, but you don't have to do the whole maintenance of something like a React or a Vue or an Angular system, which has a lot of dependencies and is a whole chore and a lot in its own to maintain. I hope to be trying out more systems like this, showing what's going on that's new in Rails and other application development, web application development. And if you want to see more of that, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Hit that like button if you found my thoughts here on low-code development platforms to be useful or helpful. And of course, if you have your own ideas to add, go ahead and write a comment about that. And let's have a conversation in the comments. So I'll see you in the next video.